who are unable to join us today will be able to access that recording. We're going to try and get that on YouTube or on our website at a later date. And we will also be offering another presentation of the risk management webinar later in the year for those who are unable to join us today. So at this time, we would like to thank Trey for presenting to our providers around the state, as well as our CCR and our staff and directors. Thank you, Trey. I'm going to give a
Absolutely.
Good morning, and we're going to just give a really brief intro and just a couple of guidelines for how the webinar will work this morning. So Trey is from the Omni Agency in New York City. He's a senior vice president with over 18 years of experience in risk management. He is responsible for growing existing markets and identifying new revenue streams and potential markets for the Omni Agency. However, he's presenting to us today from the perspective of all of the liabilities that a child care center or child care provider or CCR&R or even nonprofit really needs to be concerned with. And he can give you more information on that, I'm sure, as he goes through his presentation. So thank you again for joining us, Trey. Just a couple things. We would like this to be interactive, so if you have questions, please do type your questions in the chat box. If you don't see the chat box, just look around on your screen for a little button that says chat. And if you select that button, the chat box should pop up. And what we will do as moderators, we will share those questions with Trey, and he will do his best to keep up with your questions and address them as we go along. He will also provide his contact information so that if you have additional follow-up after this presentation, you can connect with him. So without going on any longer, thank you, Trey. Why don't we get started?
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Jessica, and thank you all for joining us this morning. I hope this will be informational, insightful, and like Jessica said, feel free to interject, ask questions. If you hear something that kind of resonates, or if you've got a story that is relatable or sounds familiar to what we're talking about, by all means jump in, because it's I want it to be interactive. And I've done a number of these, and they're always a lot more enjoyable, and I think you learn a lot more from everybody participating and people asking questions and telling stories about what they've experienced. So a little bit about me. I'm an insurance broker. I specialize in insuring Head Start and daycare and child care programs. My specialty is basically the ACS agencies and Head Start programs in the New York City 5-borough area. I probably insure 75% of them, so that's really my bread and butter. I spend most of my day working with child care, so there's a lot of moving parts to running a child care program, and what I try to do is remove the risk management and the liability side from you and take that off your plate. So hopefully you'll glean some insight into how to lower your liability and your risk exposure at your own agency. So let's go ahead and get started here and move into the next slide. There we go. So I want to talk about, I'll spend a lot of time on liability, general liability, medical payments, professional liability, which includes molestation and abuse coverages, loss control checklist, things that you can do to mitigate your exposures, additional considerations, and we have an official Q&A at the end, but like I said, questions anytime throughout this. So next slide. Okay, so really the meat of your program's insurance is the liability and workers' comp, but for now we'll stick to liability. And there's a lot of different kinds of liability and a lot of things to know about it. You should all hopefully be carrying general liability as well as professional, but general is the first peg of the insurance cog, if you will. General liability covers you for bodily injury and property damage that is sustained to third parties. So if a parent or somebody, say like myself, visits your agency, somebody leaves some water out on the floor and it wasn't cleaned up, they slip and fall, they break a leg, they're in the hospital for 2 months, they're probably going to sue you. That's what the general liability covers you for. It also covers you if you have employees that damage somebody else's property. That's not going to really be applicable to a child care program because your employees, the teachers are there at the sites. They're not out and about meeting with customers or anything like that. But if they happen to leave the premises on agency business and injure somebody or damage somebody's property, you would also be covered. A couple of other things like personal advertising injury. This is not a big exposure for you. This would be if you were advertising and maybe there was advertising copyright infringement, libel, slander, that kind of thing. But let's move on to medical payments, because medical payments is a portion of the liability, general liability coverage that's very important. Medical payments provides you no-fault medical coverage, generally only up to a limit of $5,000 or $10,000, but it's no fault. So going back to that scenario that I just gave you about somebody slipping and falling on water, maybe there's no water, maybe somebody just walks in the agency, they trip, they fall, and they break a leg. It's definitely not your fault. You were not liable. There's no negligence on your part, but they still want their medical bills to be paid for. Medical payments coverage responds to this. It's a no fault, no questions asked, and you can actually move to the next slide. It's a no questions asked portion of the insurance policy that covers a situation where you're not at fault, and it's really a goodwill type of claim payment. You'll see here on this slide that 35 to 40% of child care claims are settled within the first $5,000 of medical payments. So it's really what it does, it's there to mitigate the loss and hopefully make that situation go away so it doesn't turn into a lawsuit. Now, not every policy provides medical payments coverage. Some have it, most do, and some have limits of 5,000, some have 10,000. But it's very important to make sure you have medical payments coverage because it does, like I said, it's a huge tool in mitigating whether or not a situation evolves into a lawsuit. A lot of policies will sometimes they will not, I shouldn't say a lot, but they'll sometimes provide accident and health riders. These are supplemental riders to the general liability, which can cover the children. Again, some carriers now can exclude this if they do provide it. They can exclude children being covered under the policy even if they provide it. So it's, it's kind of a lot of information in the past two slides, but in summary, you want to make sure that you have medical payments, and then you want to ask your provider, your broker, if you have an accident or health policy that's a rider, and if you do, does it include the children? If it doesn't, you can obtain those or you can have that coverage endorsed to the policy. So let's move to the next slide. So here are some more general liability and medical payment claims examples. A child falls off of playground equipment. This is very common. We see a lot of these claims in the New York City area. If a child falls off the playground, the swing set or whatever, or if maybe they fall and there's no padding on the ground. It's very important that your playground equipment is checked for sharp edges, screws or equipment pieces of the equipment that are protruding that can cause injury. And in the New York City area, ACS requires that you have a 1.5 inch padding at all playgrounds. So it's a really good idea also to have padding. You probably already have that, but if not, it's definitely something to consider adding to your playground. It's a really good way to mitigate liability and medical payment claims. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, so let's talk about molestation and abuse and professional liability. Professional liability is the next portion of the liability policy that's really most critical to a child care agency, because under a professional liability policy, there are limits for molestation and abuse. And you wouldn't believe it, but the abuse claims are fairly frequent, and the name really provides broader coverage. When you hear something like the word abuse, you think awful stuff, or maybe a kid is being hit or something like that. But it really tends to be stuff like, this is a true example. So I've got a client right here in Brooklyn, and they're playing a learning game one day, and it was a question and answer game, and the children would raise their hand when they knew the answers. And there was one child that was better than all the rest. He kept raising his hand first, and he knew the answers every time. So the other children weren't able to play along and get involved, so on and so forth. So the teacher had a really bright idea of putting duct tape on the child's mouth. And that is it's a true story, it's a true example, and needless to say, the child went home. He was upset, he told his parents. The parents subsequently filed a lawsuit against the agency. Now, the good news is that lawsuit is covered, but it's only covered under abuse and molestation coverage, which again is part of the professional liability. So if there's one thing that's most important about this presentation, it's to make sure that you have professional liability and to make sure that you have abuse and molestation coverages. You can flip to the next slide. These coverages are really 90% of serious and large claims that can affect an agency. I can't stress enough how important this coverage is. You also want to make sure that you have adequate limits. A lot of times insurance policies will tell you, well, they'll give you molestation and abuse coverage, but they might have low limits. So if you have, say, a $1 million liability policy, they might only give you $100,000 or $250,000 or $500,000 of abuse and molestation coverage. So it's important to check your limits. And again, your insurance provider or your broker it's an easy question. They can tell you what your limits are and if you have that coverage. But moving into this slide, a good way to mitigate any potential abuse or molestation claims, are the standard risk management techniques that hopefully all of you are already employing. Background checks should be required on every person, every employee, every volunteer. All accidents should be documented. You should have an incident report form. No matter how minor the incident is, you should have an incident report form that is completed. You send that to the insurance provider, and you just put them on notice. And you'd be surprised, but it has a big effect if that incident turns into something down the road. If it was reported early on in the process, it plays a huge role in mitigating how large that incident will become, or whether it evolves into a lawsuit. Let's see. Let's move on to the next slide here. So a little bit more about abuse molestation coverage. It is, it's not only providing the agency or the center, but it's also providing coverage to the directors. So for instance, if somebody files a suit against the agency for negligent hiring, maybe you did not perform the background checks, or maybe you for whatever reason, you made a mistake, you didn't perform it on this person, they slipped through the cracks, something happened, they can sue the agency as well as the director individually. So anything that's involving or allegedly involving negligent training, negligent hiring, or negligent supervision, that's going to cover you. It also covers vicarious, and I think that's on the next slide, but it's called vicarious liability. So if, for instance, if you're on a field trip and you're at a museum, one of the children wanders off, maybe a stranger pushes him out of the way, and he falls and he breaks a leg, and the parents subsequently, they connect all the dots and they say, well, this kid wasn't being supervised, your agency wasn't doing their job, there was not adequate supervision. That would be a vicarious liability abuse claim. So it's great coverage in that it doesn't stop at the actual site. It extends to field trips or off the premises or anything of that nature. The one thing it doesn't cover is if the employee that perpetrated the abuse or molestation is let's say arrested and charged with a crime, it's not going to cover them for an actual crime. So it's kind of a gray area, but if a good way to look at it, if the employee is arrested and it comes to actually being filed as a crime, it's not going to cover that employee. It would still cover to defend you, but it's never going to cover the accused perpetrator. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Keep going till we check all those boxes. There we go. Okay, so first of all, are there any questions on liability, professional liability, abuse or molestation claims, anything like that at this juncture?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, let me pull my chat screen up here. Now, I actually do not see the questions. Can somebody read these to me? Okay, no questions. All right. Okay, excellent. So some common sense. Wait, I think I've got a question that just popped up. Yes, it does cover volunteers. Abuse molestation does cover volunteers in 90% of all policies, but that's a question you want to make sure you ask your provider. It's a great question. And interns, yes. Anybody who is there representing your facility, they will be covered. Okay, so let's move on to the checklist here. And a lot of this stuff is obviously very common sense, but I think it's always a good reminder. And it's always good to kind of just in the back of your head, you make sure you're doing this stuff. So you want to make sure that your tables, chairs, workstations are in good condition. And there's no sharp edges. Sharp edges is a big cause of claims with my clients. Also, and I always use this example because it happened last year. It's a real world example. A teacher was, I think she was heating water for tea, and she had like a pot of hot water sitting on the edge of a counter in the classroom. A child knocked it over and was scalded. It was burned. He was burned. So that resulted in a claim. And that's a really common sense thing. And you think, oh, that can never happen. But, you know, it definitely happens. So you want to make sure you're not doing things like having hot water or hot plates or any exposed surfaces that are dangerous in the classroom. You want to make sure that the walkways, the aisle spaces are well maintained. You don't want cords on the floor. You don't want anything that's an object that somebody can easily trip on. And that also applies for workers' compensation, by the way. A lot of this stuff is applicable to your employees so that they're not injured and subsequently file a workers' comp claim. Electrical outlets are covered, bookshelves bolted to the walls and will not tip over. That's a big one. One thing I always kind of get a kick out of when I go to these sites and I go to the classrooms, you know, everything's in miniature. It's cute. It's really cute to see everything so small. And you got these tiny bookshelves that are only about, you know, 2 or 3 feet high. But not all sites have those. So, you know, you want to make sure that your bookshelves are, I guess, child size is a good way to put it. Or if they're not, you know, they're bolted to the walls, and if some child decides to start climbing a bookcase, which certainly has been known to happen, they don't come tumbling over. Let's see, I've got a question here. Do you have a suggested incident report? I do. I have an incident report. I'd be happy to forward it to everybody. It's very simple. It basically captures the incident in terms of what happened, when it happened, who was involved, and whether or not there was any emergency medical attention that was needed. And then I've got some clients that complete it and they hold on to it in their own file. I've got some that send every single one of them to me. I recommend that you can kind of use a little common sense, and if it's just a scratch, you don't necessarily need to report it, but it doesn't hurt nonetheless. So I recommend you send everything to your provider or your broker, and they can hold on to them, or they can send them to the insurance company. You can also submit those as what's called an incident only, for reporting purposes only, so that when you're doing that, they're not going onto your claims history as an actual claim. You want to make sure that when you're sending these in, if they are being sent to the actual insurance company, that they're only being reported for incident purposes only. Otherwise, at the end of the year, you might have 15, 20 claims on your loss run history when they weren't actually claims, and the insurance provider will, they could theoretically cancel you. So it's an important point to make sure that if these are being sent in, they're just for reporting purposes only. Okay, so let's go to the next slide here. Yep, this kind of dovetails with the previous slide. It's very common sense stuff. You don't want splinters. You don't want, especially on these wooden desks and chairs, you don't want loose anchors or supports, and you don't want these, nuts and bolts or screws that can sometimes be exposed out of sticking out of old furniture or anything like that. What else do we have? Playground area is fenced and separated. This is a huge deal. Obviously, you want to make sure that your playground is fenced and not exposed or accessible from the sidewalks. And again, the 2-inch padding on the playground surface, or 1.5 inches, I highly recommend that. You probably already have that, but it's worth noting. It's worth mentioning again. All right, the next slide. So, fire drills. It's very important to conduct emergency training and fire drills on a regular basis, and make sure this is documented. Because if something does happen down the road and the insurance company starts poking around and they're going to be asking, did you practice these emergency situations? Did you hold fire drills like you're supposed to on a regular basis, which really should be every month? It can adversely affect you if you haven't done that. They would still cover a claim, but it could affect whether or not your insurance is renewed, or if the premium is increased or not. Other things that are important: first aid kits, CPR. Everybody, or not everybody, but you should have a handful of teachers that are certified and trained in CPR. You want to have regular testing of inspection of fire extinguishers, smoke alarms, emergency lighting, sprinkler systems, etc. Emergency phone numbers posted and on file. Okay, the next slide. So kitchen areas are, they're a biggie, and they're really a biggie more so for your employees and for workers' comp. You really obviously have to make sure that the kitchens are not accessible for the children. But this is a huge workers' comp exposure here, and if any of you have had claims with workers' comp or bad experiences, you know that workers' comp can quickly blow up and the premiums can skyrocket. It can be a real problem. It can be a real issue. So you really have to be diligent with your risk management and the employees, ensuring that you're keeping the kitchen a safe area, that there's the floors are free of grease, that you have everything properly stored, that your ANSEL system or your extinguishing system is checked properly and frequently. No grease buildups. A lot of times, a lot of my clients, the insurance companies will do inspections, and sometimes in the kitchens, they will find that it's just a bare floor. And you really need to have in front of the cooking surfaces, those kind of thick rubber pads. I'm not sure exactly what they're called, but they're really non-slip, and you place them there in front of the cooking surfaces. So it's a really good way to mitigate the chances of your employees slipping on grease or water, breaking a leg, and then they're you know, if they're out for 2 months, it's a huge expense to the workers' comp, and it's a huge problem for you because you have to replace your employee, and it can be a huge issue. So workers' comp, if we have some time, I'd like to definitely talk a little bit more about that. But let's move on to the next slide. Are homes inspected by, here's a question here, are homes inspected by insurance companies before insurance is awarded? That sounds like a family daycare program. If they are not inspected, to answer your question, the insurance companies do not inspect family daycare programs. They ask a lot of questions in the underwriting process. They want to know the license number, and they do background checks on to see if there are any violations, anything like that. But they don't actually inspect the family daycare programs. Now, in terms of sites for centers or agencies, they will inspect the site, but usually it's not prior to the insurance being bound. Generally, it's a month, maybe 2 months after the insurance is placed and bound. They'll send somebody out to inspect the premises. Is that another question I saw pop up there? It depends on the, yeah, okay. Yep, okay, and let's see, what do we have on this slide? So additional considerations and coverages. Obviously, if you own the building, you want to make sure that you have building coverage. If you don't own the building, it's very important to make sure that your contents are insured properly. Your contents are the computers, the equipment, the furniture, all of the business personal property that's used in the classrooms. Another really important coverage is tenants' improvements and betterments. So if you do not own the building, if you don't own the space, but before you move in, let's say you invest $50,000, $100,000 to make the space fit your needs in terms of a daycare, childcare site. Maybe you're installing bookcases and you're having them bolted to the wall, and you're painting stuff and whatever. But you're spending some serious money. You can cover that expense to the changes in the space that you're implementing. So if good example, if the place burns down, it's not going to pay you to rebuild the space because you don't own it, but it's going to pay you back for the investment that you put into it. So tenants' improvements and betterments is it's a really good coverage to make sure that you have if you made changes to the space. Automobile coverage and hired and non-owned coverage. If you have vehicles insured under your site, you want to make sure you have adequate limits. $1 million is the bare minimum that I would recommend. You also want to make sure you have hired and non-owned coverage. Even if you don't have a vehicle that's affiliated with your site, it's a great coverage to have. So an example of hired or non-owned is if say you're the director or the treasurer, somebody is running to the bank to make a deposit on behalf of the site, anything that's related, any business that's related to the site, they run a red light and hit somebody and they cause bodily injury and property damage, that would be covered under hired and non-owned auto. So it's very inexpensive. It's a great coverage to have, but sometimes it's not included. You just have to ask for it. Here's a question. What if you use your vehicle for transporting children in a family? Okay, well, that goes back to hired and non-owned. Two things there. You want to make sure that you definitely have hired and non-owned, but you need to make sure whoever is providing your primary automobile insurance that they are aware of what you're doing, because if they don't know that and something happens, the claim is going to be denied. So you want to make sure that if you're insured with State Farm or Geico or whatever, and you're using that vehicle, it's insured as a personal vehicle, but you're using it maybe just periodically or maybe frequently to transport children or family members or parents, they need to be aware of that, because again, if something happens and they're not aware of it, they're going to deny the claim. Absolutely. Let's see, workers' compensation. I want to touch on that briefly. NYSEF, the state insurance fund, is probably where a lot of people are insured. It is the most expensive place to be insured. You do not want to be insured there. They will sometimes, first of all, their rates are the highest for the class codes that are applicable to child care, and they will sometimes put what's called a differential on your policy. Differential is just it's a surcharge. It can be anywhere from 10% to 100%, and especially if you're a relatively new agency and you're just starting out, you probably had to go with NYSIF. That was your only option at the time, and they probably put a differential on there. So it's really important to check your workers' compensation and first of all, see if you're with NYSIF, and if you are, try to get out of NYSIF. The claim service is terrible, by the way, also. So it's just, again, you don't want to be insured with the state insurance fund unless you have to be. And there are private carriers out there. We have our own program, but there are many other private carriers that will provide very competitive child care workers' comp. You can usually save anywhere from 10 to 30% by moving out of the state insurance fund. So it's, you know, I put that in terms of saving money. That's one thing you definitely want to look at. Child accident policy, we talked about that in the very beginning, but you know, it's a good thing to have. They're inexpensive. Sometimes, like I said, you can have them added to your liability policy. Sometimes it has to be written on a separate basis, but they're, again, very inexpensive. So I would definitely recommend looking into that. And let's see, what do we have next? Okay, that's it. That's all I have. And I would like to hear from everybody out there in terms of, you know, stories they've had, experiences they've had, questions regarding liability, professional liability, workers' comp, anything. I think I've answered these questions that are here. Do we have any additional questions?
Okay, well, if we have no more questions, Trey, can you share how people can get in touch with you if they do have follow-up questions?
Absolutely. So my email address, and I can send out, I assume I can get a list of everybody, Jessica, and then maybe we can send out the incident forms.
Absolutely, we can do that.
Okay, so we'll first of all do that, but my email address is twilder, that's TWILDER, at the Omni Agency. That's THEOMNI agency.com. So if anybody needs additional information, has questions, feel free to email me. If you want to call me, my number is 718-831-7888, extension 2604. And that's it. You know, I encourage anybody to call me for questions, guidance. If you just want me to take a look at your current policy, your current information, or if you have questions about a quote that you're receiving, I'd be happy to help. So with that, I want to thank everybody. I want to thank ECLC and everybody that participated this morning. I really appreciate everybody's time.
Thank you, Trey, and thanks everybody for signing up and attending this morning. As we said, we recorded this webinar and we will be posting it either on YouTube or on our website and make that available. We'll also be surveying all attendees about this webinar so that we can tailor the material in the future and incorporate new trends and ideas. Thank you again and have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Jessica. Bye-bye.
Bye.